Caleb Whitmore
Today,
believed in
we unveil the
upgrades.
future of biotech innovation,
Upgrade the
a
company.
future that will transform lives.
Upgrade the strategy.
This marks our new direction and
Upgrade
evolution.
the image.
Vanessa, please join
And
me.
eventually, upgrade the
You could have
wife.
told me.
By
outgrew
42,
each
sitting
other.
comfortably at the top of a billion-dollar biotech empire, Caleb
founder
had trained
equity
himself
clause
to
is
see
standard,
everything
Evelyn.
through the lens of optimization. Loyalty, he decided, was
Our
just
expansion
another word
strategy
people
targets
used
key
when they were
acquisitions
afraid
in
to
North
change.
America and Europe.
What are the
Comfort,
risks to our
in his
capital?
mind, was the beginning of
This
decay.
just arrived for you.
Thank you.
And weakness, real weakness, was staying attached to a version of the past that no longer made the right impression. He told himself it wasn't cruelty. It was evolution. He told himself that the world rewarded people who were willing to shed what no longer served them. That success wasn't built by clinging, it was built by cutting weight. And somewhere during that climb, he convinced himself of a story that made it easier to breathe. The woman who helped him build Whitmore Biotech from a rented warehouse no longer matched the image of power he wanted to display. So he replaced her. Not quietly. Not respectfully. Not in private with a hard conversation and a clean ending. But publicly, under ballroom lights, surrounded by investors and photographers, with champagne glasses raised and cameras snapping as if his personal life were part of the evening's entertainment. What Caleb didn't understand was this. The wife he discarded wasn't emotional. She didn't run on rage. She didn't run on tears. She was strategic. While he was celebrating reinvention, she was rereading incorporation documents. While he was accelerating acquisitions, she was studying shareholder rights and governance bylaws. While he was chasing admiration, federal regulators were quietly reviewing his filings, calmly, methodically, the way institutions do when they're deciding whether a person is merely reckless or something worse. Within months, his stock would collapse. His board would suspend him. Prosecutors would open a case with his name printed in bold at the top. Because Caleb Whitmore made one fatal miscalculation. He thought replacing his wife would upgrade his life. Instead, it triggered the unraveling of his empire. This is not just a divorce story. It's a story about ego, legacy, and the cost of mistaking loyalty for weakness. The ballroom shimmered in gold light, crystal chandeliers scattering fractured reflections across polished marble as applause rolled like distant thunder. The room felt designed to impress, velvet curtains, brushed gold accents, florals arranged with the precision of a museum installation. Waiters moved like shadows with trays of champagne. Investors and analysts leaned into each other's smiles. Everyone there understood what a billion-dollar valuation meant, and everyone wanted to be seen close to the man who had pulled it off. At the center of it all stood Caleb Whitmore. Composed. Controlled. Effortlessly commanding. The celebrated biotech CEO whose company had crossed the threshold every founder dreams of, and whose name, tonight, was being spoken with reverence. His tuxedo was immaculate. His smile was practiced without appearing rehearsed. His voice carried the steady confidence of someone who had heard applause so often he'd started believing it was proof of correctness. He spoke about innovation. He spoke about growth. He spoke about the courage to reinvent yourself when the world expects you to remain the same. To the outside world, Caleb Whitmore was a visionary who had built Whitmore Biotech from nothing into a powerhouse. What the audience could not truly see was the woman standing just off the stage. 10 feet away. Close enough to hear every carefully chosen word. Close enough to be seen, but far enough to be ignored. Evelyn Whitmore stood poised near the edge of the crowd, her posture calm, her face serene, her expression controlled the way people control expressions when they've learned that emotion becomes a weapon in other people's hands. At 39, she carried herself with quiet intelligence, the kind that didn't demand a spotlight, yet somehow made people lower their voices when she walked by. Years earlier, when Caleb's ideas were still fragile sketches on yellow legal pads, Evelyn had invested her inheritance to fund his first prototype. Not because it was romantic. Not because she believed in fairy tales. Because she understood numbers. She understood risk. She understood what it meant when a person had something real, something worth building, if the foundation was strong enough to hold it. She negotiated early investor agreements when no one believed in them. She drafted financial projections that kept the company alive during its most precarious months. In the rented Denver warehouse where Whitmore Biotech was born, Evelyn had been as essential as oxygen. Caleb built the vision, Evelyn built the structure that kept it standing. Over time, however, their marriage shifted in ways so subtle they could be mistaken for normal stress. Success adds pressure. It magnifies personality. It changes what people crave. Caleb's hunger for admiration grew alongside the company. Media interviews multiplied. Investor dinners became routine. Praise followed him everywhere. He thrived on it, fed on it, absorbed it like sunlight. Evelyn noticed how he lingered over compliments, how he replayed interviews late at night, how he started speaking more about legacy than partnership. She valued stability, loyalty, the quiet satisfaction of shared triumphs. Caleb began to value reinvention, especially when reinvention came with applause. The first cracks were small. Late-night board meetings that stretched until dawn. Phone calls taken in hushed tones on balconies. Messages answered with a half-smile he never explained. And then came Vanessa Cole, the newly appointed executive strategist. 29. Polished in a way that looked effortless but was carefully engineered. Vanessa was perceptive, bright, and trained in the art of optics. She understood the modern language of power, branding, narrative, influence. She understood how to frame Caleb not merely as a CEO, but as a symbol of modern ambition. She praised his instincts in meetings, deferred to him in public, positioned herself as indispensable without ever appearing to compete. Where Evelyn offered partnership, Vanessa offered admiration without friction. Caleb didn't fully realize how much he missed being admired without conditions. When he returned his attention to the ballroom stage, his voice softened deliberately, as if he were about to reveal something heartfelt. "None of this growth happens alone," he said, scanning the crowd. Then his gaze settled somewhere beyond Evelyn. "Sometimes evolution requires inspiration," he continued. "Sometimes it requires someone who reminds you who you're becoming." A murmur moved through the guests, subtle, uncertain, curious. Then he extended his hand toward Vanessa. She stepped into the spotlight with practiced grace. Cameras erupted in flashes as he placed his hand gently at the small of her back. The gesture was intimate, unmistakable. Not an accident. Not a mistake. A statement. Evelyn felt the moment crystallize around her like glass hardening. There was no private conversation. No dignified warning. No attempt at respect. Just a public unveiling disguised as gratitude. Applause resumed, hesitant at first, then swelling as guests recalibrated their understanding of the scene. People adjusted their smiles. Investors looked at each other, deciding what story they were supposed to believe. Caleb did not look at his wife. He looked forward, already stepping into the narrative he had chosen. Later, in a quiet corridor away from the ballroom's noise, Evelyn found him alone for a brief moment. Her voice was calm. Almost steady. "You could have told me," she said, searching his face for a trace of the man who once shared a warehouse floor with her. Caleb exhaled slowly. "You stopped being who I needed," he replied, not cruelly, but with the detached certainty of someone rewriting history in his own favor. "We outgrew each other." The words were clinical, as if their marriage were an outdated contract rather than a shared life. Within 48 hours, divorce papers arrived at her attorney's office, accompanied by a settlement proposal that significantly undervalued her founder equity. There was also a non-disclosure agreement thick with clauses designed to secure silence. Caleb's legal team moved quickly, confidently, the way teams move when they believe speed prevents resistance. The media followed suit. Articles framed the separation as an inevitable shift. They described Evelyn as reserved, distant, perhaps unable to keep pace with Caleb's expanding vision. Anonymous sources hinted she had struggled with the spotlight. No one mentioned the inheritance she invested. No one mentioned the nights she calculated payroll projections by hand. No one mentioned the risk she absorbed without recognition. Within weeks, Vanessa was living in the penthouse Evelyn had once designed herself. The transition looked seamless from the outside, as if one chapter had been cleanly replaced by another. But beneath the polished narrative, Evelyn remained still and observant. She did not argue publicly. She did not grant interviews. She did not beg for explanations. Instead, she went to a private storage facility and retrieved a fireproof archive box containing original incorporation documents from the company's earliest days. Sitting alone at a long wooden table, she reviewed each page carefully. Her signature appeared beside Caleb's on every foundational agreement. She traced the language that defined founder classifications and share distributions. And then she saw it clearly. Her founder equity had never been legally dissolved or reclassified. The assumption that she had been written out was just that, an assumption. She stared at the signature page bearing both their names. Her expression didn't harden. It clarified. "He just made the most expensive mistake of his life," she said quietly, closing the folder with deliberate care. Outside, Caleb Whitmore continued celebrating his evolution, unaware that the woman he believed he had erased was about to remind him exactly who helped build his empire, and exactly how fragile that empire really was. Caleb Whitmore moved through Manhattan as if the city itself had endorsed his decision. The sidewalks felt like runways. The restaurants felt like stages. The skyline felt like proof. The penthouse felt different now, lighter, sharper, curated like a magazine spread. Vanessa Cole didn't just redesign the interior decor within weeks of moving in, she redesigned the narrative of his life. Neutral tones Evelyn once preferred were replaced with bold metallic accents and modern art selected for impact rather than comfort. Even the lighting changed. The space no longer felt lived in. It felt performed. Vanessa scheduled interviews back-to-back. Magazine covers featured Caleb as the embodiment of reinvention. Headlines used words like visionary, fearless, transformative. She positioned him not as a man who had left his marriage, but as a leader evolving beyond limitations. Under her direction, Whitmore Biotech's public image shifted dramatically. The messaging pivoted from careful, research-driven stability to aggressive disruption. Promotional campaigns emphasized speed and dominance. Vanessa encouraged Caleb to appear on financial news programs weekly, where he spoke confidently about expanding into international markets and acquiring smaller competitors. The attention fed him. In studio lighting, with cameras focused on his certainty, he looked unstoppable. When hosts asked about the rapid expansion, he smiled and said, "Calculated risk separate industry leaders from followers." Anchors nodded. Analysts praised him. Applause became validation. Inside the company, however, the mood was less celebratory. Daniel Mercer, the longtime chief financial officer who had weathered every early crisis alongside Evelyn, began raising concerns during executive meetings. Liquidity ratios were tightening under the strain of Vanessa's accelerated acquisition strategy. Cash reserves that once served as a safety net were being redirected into high-risk ventures. Daniel presented spreadsheets calmly. Exposure scenarios. Revenue assumptions. Contingency gaps. He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who understood that glamour is meaningless when the numbers don't support it. Caleb listened, but he no longer absorbed. "We can't keep thinking like a startup," he replied during one tense meeting. "That conservative model built survival. I'm building dominance." Vanessa sat beside him, nodding subtly, reinforcing the shift without appearing to push. She reframed Daniel's caution as outdated thinking. She suggested, politely but sharply, that legacy executives often struggled in rapid growth environments. Over time, Daniel found himself increasingly excluded from preliminary strategy sessions. Meetings were rescheduled without him. Decisions were announced rather than debated. Compliance officers circulated internal memos highlighting regulatory risks associated with one particularly aggressive overseas acquisition target. Due diligence timelines were shortened at Vanessa's urging to outpace competitors. Legal teams recommended delay. Caleb overrode them. He trusted momentum more than hesitation. Board members began noticing irregularities in reporting cadence and communication transparency. Questions surfaced quietly at first, then more directly in quarterly governance reviews. Caleb answered with polished confidence, attributing fluctuations to transitional growth. The more resistance he encountered, the more invincible he felt. Opposition confirmed, in his mind, that he was ahead of the curve. Vanessa reinforced that belief in private. "They're reacting to your speed," she told him one evening as city lights shimmered below the penthouse windows. "Leaders move first. Everyone else adjusts." Her words carried admiration without challenge. He didn't realize how much he'd started needing that. Meanwhile, Evelyn Whitmore did not respond publicly to any of it. She watched the media narrative drift toward spectacle and studied quarterly filings with disciplined focus. The more flamboyant the expansion strategy became, the more meticulous her review grew. She scheduled a meeting with Margaret Hale, one of the most formidable corporate litigators in New York. Margaret approached legal strategy the way chess masters approached the board, several moves ahead, never emotional, always precise. In a quiet conference room lined with glass walls, Evelyn laid out original incorporation documents, share classifications, and governance bylaws. Margaret reviewed them carefully, pausing only to confirm minor procedural details. When she finally looked up, her tone was measured. "You retain 18% founder equity," she said. "More importantly, you retain board influence rights that were never formally amended. The assumption that you were diluted appears legally incorrect." Evelyn absorbed the information without visible reaction, but internally the architecture of possibilities shifted. They conducted a deeper review of recent filings and board decisions. Margaret identified procedural shortcuts taken during rapid expansion. Nothing overtly illegal, yet, but enough to raise fiduciary questions. "Speed magnifies error," Margaret observed. "And ego accelerates speed." Evelyn didn't look satisfied. She looked focused. She wasn't chasing revenge. She was protecting what she helped build. Within days, she formally exercised her rights as a founder shareholder. A request for a shareholder review meeting was drafted with impeccable precision, firm, unemotional, citing governance concerns and requesting clarification on acquisition procedures and liquidity exposure. It wasn't an accusation. It was accountability. The notice arrived at corporate headquarters on a Tuesday morning. Caleb was preparing for another televised interview when his assistant placed the envelope on his desk. He opened it casually at first, expecting routine documentation. As he read, his expression shifted from mild irritation to something sharper. Evelyn's name appeared in formal print, followed by references to bylaws he hadn't revisited in years. She wasn't contesting the divorce. She was invoking structural rights. Vanessa stepped into the office as he lowered the letter. "What is it?" she asked lightly. "Nothing," he replied, though the word lacked conviction. "Just procedural noise." But it wasn't noise. It was a signal. And for the first time since the gala, Caleb felt the faintest tremor beneath his certainty. The woman he believed had accepted silence had chosen precision instead. The illusion of upgrade still shimmered publicly, but beneath it, the foundation had begun to shift. Evelyn Whitmore did not raise her voice, grant interviews, or retaliate in public. While headlines celebrated Caleb's aggressive expansion and glamorous reinvention, she moved with deliberate silence. Revenge would have been emotional, immediate and visible. Strategy required patience. From her private office overlooking the Hudson, she authorized a forensic audit of Whitmore Biotech's early corporate structure, not as an attack, but as a verification of truth. The firm she hired specialized in tracing financial shifts that most executives assumed would remain buried under rapid growth. Evelyn gave them one instruction: Follow the paper trail, not the headlines. Within weeks, subtle irregularities surfaced. Certain corporate disbursements had been categorized under strategic development expenses, yet aligned suspiciously with personal acquisitions. One property in particular, a luxury Manhattan condominium purchased through a layered holding company, raised serious questions. The timing of the acquisition coincided almost precisely with Vanessa Cole's relocation to New York. The property had been justified internally as an executive housing asset, but documentation revealed it had never been listed as company inventory. The audit team did not speculate, they presented facts. The funding source traced directly to corporate accounts approved during an unusually expedited authorization window. More surfaced. Travel budgets exceeded historical norms. Consulting fees were routed through newly formed advisory firms with minimal track records. Accelerated merger deposits were released before full compliance clearance. None of these actions were singularly explosive. But together, they formed a pattern of governance looseness that would not withstand serious scrutiny. Evelyn reviewed every report calmly, her expression unreadable. She wasn't surprised by ambition. She was concerned by carelessness. Daniel Mercer had been watching from inside the company with growing unease. For years, he balanced Caleb's bold instincts with disciplined restraint. Now he found himself sidelined, his caution reframed as resistance. One evening, after most employees had left, Daniel dialed Evelyn's private number from his car in the underground garage. His voice carried fatigue more than fear. "He's not thinking clearly anymore," Daniel said quietly, glancing at the rearview mirror as if the walls might overhear. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She let the statement sit. "He stopped thinking long before this," she said at last, measured, not bitter. Then she asked precise questions. About compliance overrides. About internal pushback. About the sequence of approvals. Daniel confirmed timelines were being compressed under Vanessa's strategic direction. Risk assessments were shortened. Dissenting opinions were minimized in official minutes. "It feels rushed," he admitted. "And rushed decisions leave footprints." As their call ended, Evelyn felt the architecture of her next move solidify. She instructed Margaret Hale to conduct a parallel review of recent SEC filings. The discrepancies were subtle but present. Revenue projections tied to the pending merger appeared optimistic beyond standard modeling variance. Certain liabilities were disclosed in footnotes rather than emphasized in summaries. Again, nothing that exploded on its own. But enough to question prudence. Margaret's assessment was clinical. "If regulators look closely," she said, "they'll ask why oversight mechanisms were relaxed." Meanwhile, Vanessa intensified her influence over Caleb. She framed the pending merger as a decisive leap that would silence skeptics permanently. In executive sessions, she emphasized speed as competitive advantage. "If we hesitate, competitors will absorb the opportunity," she insisted, presenting sleek slides filled with upward curves and confident assumptions. Caleb, increasingly insulated from dissent, approved acceleration. Compliance requested more time, he overrode the timeline. The board began requesting more frequent updates. Liquidity exposure questions were no longer whispered, they were documented. The atmosphere inside Whitmore Biotech shifted. Senior managers exchanged guarded glances. Analysts double-checked figures. Caution seeped into routine meetings where optimism once flowed easily. Caleb interpreted unease as resistance to transformation. Vanessa reassured him in private, feeding the narrative that boldness equaled brilliance. Evelyn watched from a distance, her silence strategic rather than passive. She did not leak findings to the press or confront Caleb publicly. Instead, she consolidated documentation. Audit reports were cross-referenced with board minutes and compliance memos. Margaret prepared contingency strategies should formal inquiries arise. Evelyn understood something Caleb did not. Institutions move slowly until they don't. Momentum builds quietly before shifting abruptly. Late one afternoon, rain streaking the glass facade of corporate headquarters, Caleb reviewed final merger documents. Signing would lock the company into a complex structure dependent on projected revenue streams. He hesitated only briefly before authorizing execution. Vanessa smiled, reading the signature as validation. 2 days later, an official envelope bearing a federal insignia arrived at the company's legal department. It was addressed formally to Whitmore Biotech's executive leadership. Inside was a regulatory inquiry letter requesting clarification on recent filings, acquisition disclosures, and governance procedures. The language was neutral but firm, outlining timelines and documentation requirements. When the letter reached Caleb's desk, the office felt unusually quiet. He read the first paragraph twice, the confidence in his posture diminishing incrementally. Across the city, Evelyn received a discreet notification from Margaret confirming the development. She closed her laptop slowly, her expression composed. The illusion hadn't shattered yet. But the first official crack had appeared. And this time, it carried government letterhead. The shift didn't happen overnight, yet when it came quickly. The regulatory inquiry that had first seemed like a technical inconvenience soon found its way into the financial press. Someone leaked the existence of a federal review into Whitmore Biotech's recent filings, and by the time markets opened the next morning, speculation had already outpaced facts. Analysts began questioning whether the company's accelerated acquisition strategy had bypassed critical compliance safeguards. By noon, the stock had dropped 12%, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value. For the first time since the gala, Caleb Whitmore felt something unfamiliar pressing against his certainty. Uncertainty. Investor calls flooded the executive suite. Institutional shareholders demanded specifics, not smooth reassurance. They wanted hard answers about liquidity ratios, merger disclosures, governance oversight. Caleb handled the first wave himself, projecting calm, describing the inquiry as routine. But beneath his steady tone, he felt trust eroding, grain by grain. Vanessa responded swiftly, treating the situation as a narrative challenge rather than a structural one. In private meetings, she suggested reframing the issue around legacy financial management practices that predated the company's strategic evolution. Without naming anyone directly, she implied outdated internal controls under former leadership may have contributed. The subtext was unmistakable. Distance the present from the past. When Caleb hesitated, she leaned closer across the conference table. "You inherited inefficiencies," she said smoothly. "Reform always exposes what came before." Daniel Mercer heard the implication before it was officially stated. Years of loyalty prepared him for disagreement, not scapegoating. During a tense executive session, he spoke with restrained clarity. "Every compliance structure in this company was board-approved and transparent," Daniel said. "If there are discrepancies now, they occurred after governance changes." Silence filled the room. Caleb avoided direct confrontation, but the fracture was visible. Within 48 hours, Daniel submitted his resignation, citing irreconcilable differences in strategic direction. His departure sent another ripple through investor circles. Stability had just lost its most credible symbol. While headlines turned and commentators debated, Evelyn prepared something far more precise. Through Margaret Hale, she requested an opportunity to present documentation to the board's governance committee. She compiled forensic findings outlining timelines of corporate fund reallocations, accelerated approvals, compliance overrides, clearly dated after her operational involvement ended. She didn't attack. She clarified. In a secure board session conducted via encrypted video conference, Evelyn spoke calmly, referencing documentation rather than emotion. "The structure we built was designed for disciplined growth," she said steadily. "Recent deviations warrant independent review." She did not mention Vanessa by name. She did not accuse Caleb directly. She presented timestamps, authorization sequences, and policy shifts. Facts do not need volume. Later that evening, Caleb requested a private meeting. They met in a neutral conference suite overlooking the city skyline, sterile, impersonal, stripped of history. Caleb stood near the window, tension visible in his rigid posture. "You're trying to destroy me," he said without preamble, frustration breaking through his polished exterior. Evelyn held his gaze, composed, resolute. "I'm protecting what you're destroying," she replied. "There's a difference." She reminded him governance wasn't optional. Investor trust was fragile. Ambition did not exempt accountability. Caleb paced once across the room, trying to reconcile the story he'd chosen with the reality unfolding. For the first time, doubt entered his voice. "You could have stayed out of this." "I never left it," she answered quietly. The board convened emergency sessions. Independent counsel was retained. The inquiry expanded into formal audit processes requiring extensive document production. Analysts revised forecasts. Media tone shifted from admiration to investigation. Inside headquarters, employees sensed the change. Conversations lowered. Compliance teams worked late assembling materials. Vanessa kept her outward composure, insisting transparency would resolve everything swiftly. But even she couldn't hide the acceleration of events. Control was no longer centralized. It was dispersing into regulators' hands. As evening settled over the city, another communication arrived, confidential through federal channels. It confirmed that alongside the audit, a protected complaint had been filed by an internal source alleging procedural misconduct related to merger disclosures and expense allocations. The whistleblower's identity was sealed. But the implication was clear. Scrutiny was no longer only external. It was internal. When Caleb read the notice, the room felt smaller than it had hours earlier. The empire that once seemed untouchable now trembled under formal examination. And somewhere inside his company, someone had decided silence was no longer acceptable. Truth rarely arrives with fireworks. More often it gathers like dust, quietly, steadily, in overlooked details, archived emails, timestamps that refuse to align. For weeks, Whitmore Biotech attempted to contain the narrative, presenting both the federal audit and whistleblower complaint as routine regulatory processes amplified by market anxiety. Caleb maintained public composure, repeating that the company remained fundamentally strong. But behind conference room doors, a different reality formed, built not from rumor, but from documentation. The first decisive fracture emerged during the internal data review conducted under board supervision. Compliance teams, working alongside external counsel, assembled communications tied to the accelerated merger strategy. Among thousands of routine messages were threads that suggested something more deliberate than growth urgency. Emails between Vanessa Cole and senior accounting managers referenced adjustments to earnings recognition timelines designed to optimize investor perception ahead of announcement cycles. The phrasing was sleek, corporate, carefully chosen, yet the intent was clear. Revenue was being repositioned to strengthen quarterly optics during merger negotiations. Further review revealed certain projected earnings had been advanced into reporting periods where they did not naturally belong. Internally, it was justified as anticipatory performance alignment. Technically arguable under aggressive interpretations. But the cumulative pattern suggested conscious enhancement of valuation metrics at critical moments. Caleb's digital approvals appeared beneath several exchanges, brief acknowledgements, confident commands. Proceed. Align with strategy. Move forward. They weren't hidden. They were decisive. When independent counsel presented preliminary findings to the board, the atmosphere shifted from concern to alarm. The whistleblower complaint, once theoretical, now looked substantiated by internal correspondence. Within hours, news outlets reported investigators were reviewing executive-level communications tied to earnings disclosures. The market responded with brutal speed. Over 48 hours, Whitmore Biotech stock fell 27%, erasing billions in market capitalization. Institutional investors filed formal notices demanding corrective action. By the third day, a shareholder lawsuit was filed in federal court alleging breach of fiduciary duty and material misrepresentation. The complaint cited manipulated earnings timing and questioned whether executives prioritized valuation optics over compliance transparency. Caleb read the filing in silence, his jaw tightening as each paragraph reframed his leadership as recklessness rather than vision. Media narratives transformed almost overnight. Commentators who once praised boldness now questioned judgment. Analysts replayed old interview clips, Caleb's confident reassurances, against the backdrop of emerging documentation. Headlines no longer celebrated reinvention. They warned about overreach. Vanessa's media appearances stopped abruptly. Scheduled interviews were cancelled due to ongoing review sensitivity. Public statements emphasized collective executive responsibility rather than personal strategy design. Behind closed doors, tension turned into confrontation. In the penthouse living room that once symbolized Caleb's upgrade, silence felt heavy. Vanessa stood near the window, arms folded, as Caleb placed printed emails on the glass table. "You said this was defensible," he said, controlled, but edged with accusation. "It is defensible," Vanessa replied, calm. "You signed the approvals. You engineered them," Caleb shot back. "You structured the timing." Vanessa met his gaze. Her voice stayed even. "You wanted acceleration. I delivered acceleration." Responsibility, once shared in ambition, began to split under pressure. The board convened an emergency session to assess leadership continuity. Independent directors weighed reputational risk against operational stability. Investor confidence was deteriorating. Regulators expanded document requests. After hours of deliberation, the board voted to place Caleb on temporary suspension as CEO pending the investigation's outcome. The press release was carefully worded, procedural prudence, not presumption of guilt. But symbolism doesn't need harsh language. Caleb felt the ground shift. Authority could be withdrawn by majority vote. Vanessa responded publicly with a brief statement supporting transparency and accountability. Privately, she began consulting independent counsel. Across the city, Evelyn observed developments without outward triumph. She anticipated correction, not spectacle. Yet she understood that exposure, once begun, rarely stays contained. Each revelation triggers another inquiry. Each inquiry uncovers another trail. Institutions do not respond to emotion. They respond to evidence. Late one afternoon, as Caleb reviewed legal correspondence outlining possible exposure, another envelope arrived, bearing a federal seal more formal than previous communications. Inside was a subpoena requiring testimony regarding earnings disclosures, merger communications, and executive approvals. The language was direct, unambiguous. Caleb set it down slowly. Suspension had been temporary. Scrutiny had been professional. A subpoena was personal. Now the truth demanded his presence under oath. Power rarely collapses in a single dramatic moment. More often it drains away through measured decisions, board votes, legal notices, quiet restrictions disguised as procedure. Caleb Whitmore learned that truth the morning the board formally removed him as acting CEO of Whitmore Biotech. The press release cited leadership restructuring during regulatory review. It was crafted to stabilize markets. But everyone understood what it meant. The founder who once dominated earnings calls was no longer authorized to speak for the company he built. There were no raised voices. No public shouting. No viral footage. Just quiet finality. Directors who once deferred to his instincts avoided eye contact. Their decision was framed as fiduciary necessity. Investor confidence required visible accountability. By the end of the day, Caleb's executive access was restricted. Systems denied him entry. Assistants received new instructions. Doors that once opened automatically now required permission. Vanessa responded differently. She did not fight the board publicly. She did not defend Caleb in interviews. Within 48 hours, she arranged to move out of the penthouse, citing privacy during ongoing legal review. Boxes were moved through a private service elevator. Decorative pieces vanished. Personal documents were removed. Even digital photo archives were selectively edited, as if she were erasing not only the relationship but the record of it. Caleb noticed how efficiently admiration can disappear. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded beyond regulatory clarification. Federal prosecutors examined internal communications for intent. They interviewed finance managers, compliance officers, administrative staff. Each testimony added dimension. What once looked like aggressive strategy now looked like deliberate misrepresentation. Legal analysts speculated cautiously on television, careful phrasing, cautious tone, but the implications were heavy. Investors moved swiftly. Institutional shareholders filed civil suits alleging breach of fiduciary duty, arguing leadership prioritized short-term valuation over sustainable governance. The lawsuits were meticulous emails, board minutes, financial statements. Caleb read each filing and saw his own signature beneath approvals he once considered routine. Ego framed those approvals as decisive leadership. Litigation reframed them as evidence. Inside headquarters, a different energy took shape. Evelyn stepped into interim governance discussions with controlled resolve. She did not present herself as savior. She did not mention betrayal. Her focus remained structural. In collaboration with independent directors, she outlined stabilization measures aimed at restoring investor confidence, expanded transparency protocols, reinstated compliance timelines, full access granted to external auditors. Employees who had felt uncertainty began sensing direction again. Margaret Hale negotiated carefully with federal authorities, positioning the company as cooperative. By voluntarily providing documentation and facilitating interviews, Whitmore Biotech signaled institutional accountability separate from individual liability. The strategy was deliberate. Protect the company's future while allowing investigations to assess executive responsibility independently. For Caleb, however, the separation between company and self felt impossible. Whitmore Biotech carried his name. His mythology. His origin story. He hired criminal defense counsel who reviewed communication logs in brutal detail. During one late-night session, his attorney paused over a thread that looked incomplete. Metadata suggested several exchanges between Caleb and Vanessa regarding earnings alignment had been deleted prior to the audit's escalation. Backup retrieval yielded fragments, not full context. Were these discussions documented elsewhere? The attorney asked carefully. Caleb searched his memory, recalling how Vanessa often insisted certain conversations be held verbally rather than via email. At the time, it felt like efficiency. Now it looked like insulation. And their absence shifted interpretive weight onto what remained. His visible approvals. Isolation deepened in the weeks that followed. Allies limited contact. Media inquiries were rerouted. The penthouse, once full of curated energy, echoed with emptiness. Caleb began revisiting moments he'd dismissed. Daniel's caution. Compliance requests. Evelyn's calm insistence on discipline. Each memory felt less like resistance and more like warning. Late one rainy afternoon, prosecutors notified his counsel. Findings were being prepared for a grand jury to determine whether criminal charges would be filed. The language was restrained. But the meaning was unmistakable. When Caleb read the notice, consequence finally eclipsed denial. Power hadn't vanished in a dramatic explosion. It had been surrendered incrementally, through unchecked confidence. And now accountability approached in a forum where admiration meant nothing. The indictment arrived without spectacle, yet its impact was absolute. A federal grand jury charged Caleb Whitmore with securities fraud and misleading disclosures tied to earnings representations during the accelerated merger period. The document was structured, unemotional, and devastating. It outlined approvals, reporting shifts, investor statements prosecutors argued failed to reflect material risk. For years, Caleb's signature symbolized authority. Now it anchored a criminal filing. News broke within minutes of court submission. Financial networks interrupted programming. Headlines reframed the narrative. What was once reinvention now became cautionary excess. Analysts replayed old interview clips, Caleb's confident assurances, against the hard language of regulatory findings. Corporate partners issued careful distancing statements. Industry associations suspended his advisory memberships pending legal resolution. Invitations disappeared. Calls stopped returning. His calendar emptied as if someone had erased him with a single keystroke. The most painful shift wasn't only legal, it was identity. Whitmore Biotech carried his name. Now commentators referred to former CEO Caleb Whitmore as though the title had never truly belonged to him. The company moved forward with deliberate detachment. Press releases emphasized governance reform, restored compliance discipline, institutional stability, language carefully designed to separate the organization's future from one individual's failure. Evelyn's role expanded quietly. The board publicly acknowledged her status as co-founder and early architect of the firm's financial structure. Media outlets began revisiting archival footage and early interviews highlighting her contributions. A major business journal featured her as the stabilizing force in the company's formative years. The correction wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. Inside headquarters, morale stabilized. Compliance teams reported to independent oversight. Financial disclosures were reviewed externally before release. The atmosphere became disciplined, sustainable. Vanessa receded from visibility. Her name appeared less in reports. Profiles were quietly updated. Though not formally charged, she distanced herself from public association with Caleb's leadership decisions. In interviews, she emphasized collaboration and diffused accountability. Absence became its own statement. For Caleb, collapse felt less like an explosion and more like suffocation. Counsel advised exploring plea negotiations to mitigate sentencing exposure. Prosecutors signaled openness to reduce charges in exchange for acknowledgement and cooperation. It was pragmatic. Trial risk carried uncertainty. Negotiation offered control. But accepting responsibility meant admitting publicly that the story he called bold transformation had crossed into misrepresentation. In desperation, Caleb reached out to Evelyn. They met in a private office at headquarters, neutral territory stripped of personal history. Caleb looked diminished, not physically, but emotionally narrowed. "You could help me," he said, voice carrying an unfamiliar fragility. "Your statement could influence perception." Evelyn regarded him steadily, the weight of shared years visible but not dominant. "I already did," she replied evenly. "For years." No anger. Only clarity. She had defended his vision when investors doubted. Stabilized finances when projections faltered. Help had never been withheld, it had been dismissed. Caleb lowered his gaze, understanding too late that support and accountability weren't interchangeable. He had mistaken loyalty for permanence. Now permanence belonged to legal records, not admiration. As Whitmore Biotech prepared for another transition, the board convened to vote on permanent executive leadership. They reviewed stabilization metrics under Evelyn's guidance. Investor confidence improved. Regulatory cooperation proceeded. The vote was conducted confidentially, sealed until release. Caleb waited for news while watching tickers scroll across muted television screens. Each headline about Whitmore Biotech omitted his name. The man who once dominated the narrative now watched from the margins as his legacy was rewritten without him. The board's decision was released at precisely 9 o'clock the following morning. Concise. Deliberate. Irreversible. Evelyn Whitmore was appointed permanent chief executive officer of Whitmore Biotech, effective immediately. The statement emphasized continuity, governance reform, and restored investor confidence. It acknowledged her role as co-founder and credited her early financial architecture as foundational to survival and growth. There was no mention of Caleb beyond a brief reference to prior leadership transition. The separation was complete, not through hostility, but institutional clarity. Inside headquarters, the reaction was steady rather than celebratory. Employees had endured months of uncertainty. What they wanted was stability. Evelyn addressed the company in a live internal broadcast. No dramatic stage. No theatrical lighting. A simple conference setting, clean and direct. Her voice was measured. She outlined reforms already underway, expanded compliance oversight, independent audit committees with real authority, transparent reporting protocols designed to keep acceleration from outrunning accountability. She didn't mention betrayal, scandal, personal grievance. She spoke about stewardship. Sustainable growth, she said, is built on trust. Trust is built on integrity. It resonated because it wasn't reactive. It was foundational. Governance restructuring moved quickly. Executive compensation models were revised to align long-term incentives with compliance performance. Reporting hierarchies were adjusted so legal counsel retained autonomous authority. Investor briefings shifted tone from ambition to discipline. Analysts responded cautiously, then with incremental confidence as quarterly reports reflected steadier metrics. The stock stabilized, no longer inflated by spectacle, but supported by credibility. Meanwhile, Caleb faced a different trajectory. After weeks of negotiation, he accepted a reduced plea agreement avoiding trial but requiring acknowledgement of misleading disclosure practices and substantial penalties. Restrictions were imposed on serving as an executive officer of a public company for a defined period. The courtroom proceedings were procedural, restrained. No spectacle. When the judge finalized the agreement, the gavel didn't echo dramatically. It simply closed a chapter. But for Caleb, that sound carried more weight than any market swing. His legacy was no longer defined by innovation. It was defined by warning. Vanessa remained under separate regulatory review. Though not criminally charged at that stage, her professional reputation thinned. Invitations to panels stopped. Consulting opportunities evaporated. She issued a careful statement expressing confidence in her conduct while cooperating with authorities. But in corporate ecosystems built on perception, distance often speaks louder than defense. Public perception shifted gradually but unmistakably. Media profiles reframed Evelyn as resilience rather than rejection. Journals revisited early days in the Denver warehouse, highlighting her modeling, negotiations, and risk mitigation. Commentators contrasted disciplined governance with ego-driven expansion. The redemption arc unfolded without theatrics because it didn't need them. It was built on documentation. Patience. Refusal to escalate emotionally. One evening, months after her appointment, Evelyn returned alone to the original warehouse where Whitmore Biotech began. The building had been repurposed, but the brick walls remained. She stood in the parking lot, remembering cold nights debating cash flow beside humming prototype equipment. There had been ambition then, but also humility. They understood risk because they felt it personally. Success came later, with scale and attention. Somewhere during ascent, discipline was mistaken for limitation. She didn't linger. The visit wasn't sentimental. It was reflective. Loyalty, she realized, had never been weakness. It was strength misinterpreted by someone who equated admiration with permanence. Integrity had seemed slower than acceleration, yet in the end, it was more durable. The empire that nearly fractured under ego stabilized under accountability. As the skyline glowed beyond her office windows later that night, Evelyn reviewed a compliance report with the same focus she once gave early investor drafts. The company's future would not depend on spectacle. It would depend on structure. Outside, headlines no longer centered scandal, they discussed reform. Whitmore Biotech survived not because it avoided collapse, but because it confronted it. Across town, Caleb lived in a smaller apartment. His calendar was mostly empty. Interviews stopped. Invitations no longer came. The absence of recognition was quieter than criticism and more profound. He once believed evolution required shedding what anchored him. Instead, shedding loyalty unanchored him entirely. In the end, the ultimate price wasn't limited to legal penalties or financial restitution. It was the erosion of legacy. The rewriting of narrative. The slow, undeniable realization that power untethered from integrity dissolves under scrutiny. Vindication didn't require revenge. Justice didn't require spectacle. It required endurance. And as the story closed on the empire he once commanded, one truth remained unmistakable. Caleb Whitmore thought he erased his wife. Instead, he erased himself. If stories about power, legacy, and quiet strength matter to you, stay with us. Some lessons aren't just entertainment, they're reminders. And if you believe integrity still matters in leadership, you already know why stories like this need to be told. In the end, Caleb lost more than a company. He lost the version of himself that once understood partnership. Success didn't destroy him, ego did. And Evelyn never needed revenge. She only needed patience. But here's the real question. When ambition starts growing, how do you know whether you're evolving? Or just abandoning the people who built you? If you were in Caleb's position, would you have recognized the difference in time?